Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. We are bearing down on an off-year or midterm congressional election. With me today to talk about that is Dr. Dave Kreuger, former professor of history here at the college. Welcome back.
Thank you.
True or false, throughout American history, normally the party that controls the White House loses seats in these midterm elections.
Generally true.
And why is that?
Why is that? I think in part it's because the president develops a record and in the process antagonizes people. Presidents also, when they win in a presidential election, also usually bring along some members of their party who might not have won otherwise. And then in a coattails, it's called, bring them in on coattails. And the coattails grow very, very short to non-existent by the time the midterm election rolls around.
President Bush, this will be his second midterm election.
That is correct.
Does the party in power tend to lose more seats in that second midterm election than in the first one?
Generally that is the case. Not always, but generally so. This time, in this year, I think we have a situation where there is much anxiety in the country over the war in Iraq, which seems to have bogged down. There is alarm about the situation in North Korea, in Iran. The United States seemed to be ineffective in this latest war in the Middle East that involved Israel against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We seem not to have the military force to be able to deal with all of these situations. Although the economy has been growing, wages have been stagnant, oil prices spiked. They're declining now, but they did spike. There's concern, I think, about how prisoners that we have taken from the Middle East are being treated. And then you cannot discount local issues or state issues too in all of this. And in a couple of states that's probably driving the anti-incumbent or anti-Republican steam engine right now. A similar thing happened to Franklin Roosevelt when he was approaching the 1938 midterm elections. He was in the same position in terms of tenure of office as was George Bush today. And by 1938, there was resistance building up against his New Deal program. He attempted to get Democrats sympathetic to him, elected in primaries, and he failed at that and faced a backlash, in this case, within his own party.
That, of course, is risky business to go out and campaign on behalf of candidates of your own party. 1866, Andrew Johnson tried that.
That is correct.
What was the result?
And the result, of course, is that Andrew Johnson lost control. Not only, well, he didn't have control of Congress, but he contributed to a huge Republican majority. He was a Democrat in a veto-proof Congress. In fact, the 1866 elections, with the exception of one other midterm election, the 1866 congressional elections are probably the most important congressional elections in American history. Rarely do congressional elections result in a change in policy. They may stop or hinder policies that an administration is attempting to carry out, but they do not result in grand new initiatives. In 1866, however, when the Republicans gained a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress, they could override presidential vetoes. They gained control of Reconstruction at that time and put in place their Reconstruction program. The only other congressional elections that rank up there in importance, believe it or not, are the first congressional elections in 1788, when the Constitution was going into effect for the first time. There was much opposition to the new Constitution. And fortunately, both houses of Congress received majorities in favor of the new Constitution. In other words, there was a Congress committed to making the Constitution work. That was critically important.
Mm-hmm. An exception to this rule, of course, is 1934. Roosevelt's elected in 32 in a landslide. 34 Was it a mandate on the New Deal, would you say?
I would think
A referendum, I should
a
say.
referendum on the New Deal. Yes, I would think so. And continuing anger and resentment against the Republicans, who had been in power, with an exception here and there, since the 1890s. And the Republicans, and Herbert Hoover in particular, received blame for the coming of the Great Depression. The Republican majority in Congress was wiped out in 1930. Franklin Roosevelt won in 1932. Democrats picked up more seats. In 1934, someone said the Republican Party was becoming an endangered species. Well, in the long run, that has not proved to be the case. And that, I think, represented the fact that Roosevelt was attempting to do something to fight the Depression.
That brings up an interesting point, and that is the resiliency of the two political parties. I remember 1964, the Democrats gleefully chortled Gold Waterloo, and then 4 years later, the Republicans are back. Republicans cheered that Reagan had completely realigned everything. Then Clinton comes back. How do you account for the resilience of these two big parties?
The resilience of these two big parties, I think in part it can be accounted for with our federal system. There is no such thing as a national presidential election. There are 50 state presidential elections. And what I mean by that is that in order to get on the ballot, a presidential candidate must file 50 times, once in each state, meeting each state requirements. That makes it extremely difficult for minor parties to break into the political system that we have. In addition to that, there is a tendency for the two major parties to absorb portions of platforms of minor parties, thus rendering those minor parties ineffective. However, the landscape has changed, and changed rather dramatically over the last probably 50 or 60 years, and that has to do with the rise in the number of independent voters. Party loyalty is not what it once was. In fact, neither of the two major parties, Republican or Democratic, can claim a majority following among the American people. I think independents probably comprise 25–30% of the American electorate right now. So the parties do face challenges in those respects.
That also is a very interesting point. I think that there is obviously there's a very political parties that's negative to a lot of people. An independent is, you're independent. You stand on your own. Is that part of this American psyche here that we like, the rugged individualist, the independent thinker, the independent party person?
I think that's part of it. But I think also part of it is the fact that in contrast to most other industrial countries, American political parties are weak. A political party cannot compel any member, be it elected or rank and file member, to march to the party platform. And as a result, you find Democrats ranging from liberal to conservative. You find Republicans ranging from conservative to moderate within both of these parties. And so the parties they're big tent parties. And the National Party cannot compel a member to support the platform. In contrast, especially, say, to European political parties. I think Americans at one time found political parties to be a primary source of entertainment and jobs. You have to go back to the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s and really through the 19th century to see this. And voter turnout was staggering. 60, 70, 80% of the electorate turning out and voting. In the 20th century and continuing on to the 21st century, new forms of entertainment, mass media have emerged, and I think that has reduced the importance of political parties.
One thing that has always fascinated me is through the years, we have opened the political system up step by step by step. Direct election of United States senators, primary elections, one person, one vote, 18 years old and on. And yet, voter participation declines. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it does. One of the reasons, perhaps, for the decline in voter participation is the direct primary. I think to run in a primary here in Kentucky, you have to have 2 witnesses affirm that you are a member of the party, and I think you have to promise that you voted for the party's candidates in the last election, which of course nobody can prove or check because we have a secret ballot. And so you can get on the ballot and run in the party's primary. That's in contrast to party conventions, where the party faithful or the members who work hard for the party get together and choose a candidate. The problem with the direct primary, people can get nominations. They may not have the allegiance within the party, and it may be difficult to get them to energize a base and get people to turn out.
So would it be better to go back to the convention method?
It might be, but you aren't going to find any candidates advocating that, because party conventions rank right up there in American thinking with that dreaded word lobbyist. So that probably will not happen. So parties then have lost, in a sense, control over the nominating process.
Why has the United States developed a multi-party system, would you say? So we have the 2 major parties, less allegiance to the Democrats, less allegiance to the Republicans. Why hasn't some other third party emerged permanently? And we do have third parties, obviously the populists and so on.
Yes, we do.
But why hasn't a third party come along to challenge these 2 big ones lately?
Lately, I would say that's because this is fundamentally a very conservative nation. I know people are surprised when you hear that term, but I'm not speaking in terms of contemporary politics. I mean, the values that most Americans hold are allegiance to capitalism, allegiance to the Constitution. They believe in a 2-house legislature, and the list can go on and on and on. And therefore, Americans are very, very cautious about more than 2 parties. Our parties are not ideologically divided in the sense that, say, European political parties are, in terms of wanting an alternate economic system, for example. Both parties agree in capitalism. Both parties believe that the United States Constitution provides the best framework for government in this country. They both believe that federalism is best. Where they disagree is over the extent of government involvement in the economy or in society. There are some other differences between the parties as well. One party, the Democratic Party, throughout its history, going back into the 1830s, has tended to be the party that attracts minorities in this country. Immigrants, black voters today. The Republican Party, on the other hand, has tended to be the party of what you would call the respectable Americans. These are the businessmen, the people who earn a proper amount of money, who are active in the civic affairs in a city, and those differences do remain. But again, they're not hard and fast. And so again, you've got this situation where you've got these big tent political parties.
So essentially what you're saying is this congressional election, the party chair, the party committee in Washington doesn't have all that much control over all these people in Colorado and Kentucky and Tennessee and various places. So they're giving different messages.
That indeed is true. In fact, a good example of that, I think, is what happened in the Rhode Island primary, Republican primary for Senate. Lincoln Chafee, a Republican, moderate, faced a tough fight in the Republican primary from a conservative who would have been more aligned with Bush and the leadership in the United States Senate today. In Washington, the Republican committee decided that they would rather have Lincoln Chafee, although he was at odds with the Bush administration, Lincoln Chafee win that primary because he probably would stand a better chance beating the Democrat. And so what the Republicans did was to get on the phone, and they called Democrats and independents in Rhode Island and said, hey, switch your party allegiance to the Republican Party, vote in our primary for Chafee, then after the primary is over, you can change your allegiance back to Democratic or independent. And so when it comes to elections, it must be said that opportunism knows no bounds.
It's the numbers game.
It is.
Because, again,
It is. But again, because if you don't,
Right.
parties exist to win elections so they can control policy.
Right.
And if you can't win elections, you can't control policy.
Right, right. And you're absolutely correct that if Chaffee, you're right, had the conservative won, given the political climate in Rhode Island, the Democrat would have pick up for the Democrats, -1 for the Republicans, +1 for the Democrats.
Yeah. This year, although people may not think so, the balance between Republicans and Democrats, particularly in the House, but to a good extent in the Senate, is relatively close. We don't have a huge lopsided Republican majority. I believe there are 232 Republicans in the House. There are 201 Democrats. You need 218, I believe, to control a majority in the House. There are perhaps 38 Republican seats that are endangered, that could go Democratic. In the Senate, there are, 55 Republicans, 44 Democrats, and 1 independent. If the Democrats can pick up probably 6 seats, they would gain control of the Senate. However, it must also be said that when the difference between the parties in the Senate or the House is razor thin or very close, it also means that each House is not going to be particularly effective. You really need a large, substantial majority in order to push things through Congress.
The last president to have huge majorities was Roosevelt, would you say?
Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson did to some extent too.
But again, with Johnson and Roosevelt also, you had these Southern Democrats who most often voted Republican.
That indeed is true. Roosevelt, at least in his first term, had many of the Southern Democrats with him. But when the Roosevelt administration began to provide some assistance for Afro-Americans in the South, and when the Roosevelt administration in particular began to champion minimum wages and some control over working conditions, then Southern Democrats tended to side with the Republicans. Yeah, if a president has a majority of his own party in Congress, it's not a panacea and it's not a guarantee that the president will be able to push his policies through. In fact, Congress, the houses in Congress do guard their prerogatives very jealously. They are an independent branch of the government.
And there again, that you compare and contrast that to a European parliamentary system where the prime minister is the prime minister, whereas here you have the separation of powers.
Right.
And I think that Europeans find that difficult to fathom, is how a Republican or a Democrat can go against his or her party and survive.
Right. But that is possible. We talked about national issues having an impact in congressional districts and in states for Senate elections, but oftentimes elections turn on what you might call local issues. There are 3 or 4 House seats held by Republicans now that are up for grabs in Indiana. And one of the reasons there is such anger with Republicans in Indiana is because of the Indiana governor, a Republican, and he wanted to lease the Indiana toll road to a private company. That outraged many people. And then, worst of all, he transferred some counties to another time zone.
Right.
Now, if you want to bring political passions to the forefront, you start talking about tinkering with people's clocks, and you got all kinds of troubles.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of local issues all over the country like that. You're absolutely right.
But it is also true, I think, that many of these elections are not going to be decided, at least on the surface, by issues as such, because of the art of negative campaigning. And the 30-second or 1-minute negative ad in which you basically attack the other candidate, which is a nice way of saying, I'm going to attack the other candidate, but I'm not going to tell you what I stand for. It's like saying my record speaks for itself and then never speaking about your record, which is a common ploy.
It's effective.
It can be effective, but if carried to extremes, it can also turn off some voters.
But we've had negative campaigning, since 1796?
Oh, heavens,
when
yes.
Jefferson was
Right.
going to burn all the Bibles. He was
That's
a
right.
Jacobin, and the French Revolution would come to America. And then Old Hickory, spelt Europe, U-R-O-P, and
That's
all
right.
that kind of
Right.
silliness.
We've had all kinds of negative campaigning. Franklin Roosevelt was known by his enemies as that man
That
in
man.
the White House.
That's right.
So yes, we've had negative campaigning. We've had dirty tricks in politics going on, for years. The neatest dirty trick that's something to do with congressional elections had to do when Nixon was, I don't remember if this was 1968 or 72 when he was running for re-election. He made a whistle-stop tour on a train. And a fervent Democrat dressed up as a conductor. And in the middle of Nixon's speeches, from the observation car at the end of the train, the conductor gave the signal to the engineer to pull out of the station, and the train left the station. And neither party is above doing stuff like that. So those kinds of hijinks go
That's
on.
all part of the fun. So,
Yeah.
so in November, the entire U.S. House is up, and 1/3 of the Senate.
That is correct.
Now explain how that works. Well, why don't we have the whole Senate up with the House?
The Constitution provides that 1/3 of the senators should stand for re-election every 2 years. And this is so the body will have continuity. The Senate was regarded, senators serve a 6-year term, a long term, and the Senate was regarded, when the Constitution was written, the Senate was regarded as the body that would serve as a check on popular opinion. And for some strange reasons, that still works today, to some extent. So only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. What that means is that many senators can exercise independence in their thinking and in their voting, because 6 years from the beginning of a term, people aren't going to remember those issues. The voter has a very short memory.
Right.
In the House of Representatives, all 435 representatives stand for re-election every 2 years. Representatives are always running for re-election. And the idea there is that in this way, the House would reflect better the views of the people.
Our colleague, Gerald Watkins, political science professor, says the big winner almost every election is the incumbent party. It's hard to get them out, isn't it?
That is true, for a number of reasons. I mentioned that there are perhaps 38 districts that are up for grabs.
Which means a whole
out
lot
of 435 districts.
Right.
So we're talking about 90% of districts for the House are safe districts. The incumbent will get reelected. And incumbents work hard to make sure they come from safe districts, and that includes Kentucky. It's why you have these congressional districts that look like amoebas or salamanders, from whence comes the term gerrymander.
Right.
And that is to make certain that a majority of the voters are members of your party in your district. Incumbency also has name recognition. You know the incumbent. His name is in the newspaper.
You get to hand out checks.
You get to hand out checks at critical time. You get coverage in the local media. You do favors for your constituents. You help them out if they have a problem with Social Security Administration. That person is liable to vote for you regardless of how you feel about important national issues.
On any other issues, right.
Yeah, so incumbency is important. Money is important, but money does not necessarily guarantee victory. For years and years, when the Democratic Party was the majority party in this country, they were outspent by the Republicans. But the Republicans did not win. Money has become a little more critical, though, today, because campaigns are primarily television-based. Now, that may be changing with the advent of the computer and websites. But it costs money to develop ads that are going to grab the attention of the viewers, and to concentrate large numbers of these ads as you approach the election day.
Let's talk about the first congressional district to get your opinion on this. This district historically was known as the Gibraltar of democracy. Capital D is in the Democratic Party.
That's correct.
Democrats won every time. Oftentimes, the Republicans wouldn't even put up a candidate, or there would be a token candidate. Now we have Ed Whitfield, who is won and won and won and won, and every time he wins, he increases his victory margin. So the question to you is, has the first district realigned and gone Republican?
Probably so, except at the local level. In most counties in the first district, the courthouse crowd, city city government, the elected people there, are usually Democrats. They have not been able to compete at that level. The process of becoming Republican, however, is cumulative. Had a political science professor at the University of Kentucky, Malcolm Jewell, who was an authority on Kentucky politics, who said that every time a Kentuckian in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, every time a Kentuckian voted Republican, the Democratic habit of voting was weakened. And that indeed was true. This state has gone Republican in presidential elections.
Mm-hmm.
The Democratic Party, since World War II, has been a party that has been controlled primarily by urban states. And urban states tend to have more liberal outlooks, and this means more liberal candidates. Kentucky tends to be people who contain a huge number of people who are very conservative in their views. And quite frankly, the change from Democratic to Republican in this district, I don't think represents any change in views whatsoever. People like Julian Carroll are very conservative.
Carroll Hubbard.
Carroll Hubbard, very, very conservative. What's happened in this district is that they've changed party labels, not party views.
And one could say that the majority of Kentucky Democrats elected are conservative, certainly by national standards.
That indeed is true. They are conservative.
So that made the switch easier for the first district.
It made the switch easier. And periodically in the state, Republicans have been able to win Senate seats.
Yeah, Thurston Morton, John Sherman Cooper.
That is true, and they have been able to win the governorship. Louis Nunn is a good example. Periodically that has happened. The Republican Party was not a moribund entity as it was in the Deep South in the 20th century, not in Kentucky.
We have less than a minute, but another thing that intrigues me is we've got these important congressional elections coming up here in November, but yet we're already talking about that 07 governor's race in Kentucky. That is attracting people. Who's going to run for governor in 07? In Kentucky, that is the prize, is it not? The governorship. To a lot of Kentucky.
which surprises me to no end, because it has been a political dead end for decades. Generally speaking, people who are elected governor, when they leave office, that is the end of their political career. They go nowhere.
Right. But historically, it's the grand prize. For whatever reason.
Really, the grand prize ought to be election to the U.S. Senate.
One would think.
That is a prestigious office. It's a 6-year term. You're not running for re-election that often. That is the office that ought to be the grand prize.
And our term is up. Our time is up. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today was Dave Kreuger. We'll see you next time. Thanks.